from yesterday, you know a little bit about this case. You know that a gentleman named Johnathan Letendre broke into a home in Chesterfield, and you know that the defendant, Brian Camp, shot him to death. And when you heard that, let's be honest, a couple of you probably thought, well, why are we here? What's the crime there? He broke in, he got shot, he died. Sounds clean cut, doesn't it? Well, there's a lot more to this story. And this is my opportunity to fill in some of those details and to tell you the complete story. And to tell you why we are here today and why Mr. Camp is charged with manslaughter. So as the judge said just a few moments ago, I'd ask you to keep an open mind and wait until you've heard all the evidence before you draw any conclusions. So let's start off with a little bit about who Johnathan Letendre was. He was 27 years old. He was the general manager for Dunkin' Donuts franchises in the Haydenville, Northampton area. And it was through his work at Dunkin' Donuts that he met a young woman named Brooke Janik. Brooke Janik is at the center of this case. She was the on-again, off-again girlfriend of the defendant. And she was also in the home that night when Johnathan Letendre broke in. During a break in Brooke's relationship with Mr. Camp in early 2022, when they had split up, Mr. Letendre and Ms. Janik struck up a relationship. It was a brief relationship, it was sexual in nature, and then it broke off. Brooke Janik went back to Mr. Camp, resumed their relationship. They were raising two young children together, and Johnathan Letendre didn't take this well. He didn't think that Mr. Camp treated Ms. Janik properly, and he engaged in some unpleasant conduct toward Ms. Janik. Sent some disparaging text messages, wouldn't leave her alone, and on the evening of December 27th, he made a tragic, awful, and ultimately fatal decision. For reasons we may never fully know, he drove up to Brooke Janik's house in Chesterfield. He texted her either when he got there or on his way there saying, "Can you talk? I can't sleep." He parked his vehicle on the roadway. He walked toward the house. He let himself into that house around 12:30 in the morning. And I'm not going to try to sugarcoat anything with you, okay? He had a pair of handcuffs in his pocket. He had a decorative knife in his jacket pocket. Now, whether he carried these things routinely or whether he brought them there for a purpose, no one can really say. But when he went into that house, when he crossed that threshold, at night, uninvited, unannounced, he was absolutely breaking the law. This was a burglary, this was a break-in. He had no right to do that. Brian Camp and Brooke Janik are upstairs, second floor, Cape-style house. Brooke hears some noise. She hears some creaking on the stairs. She gets up to check to see what that is because her children are across the hall sleeping. She and Brian are in bed. And as she gets up and turns the corner to see what this noise is, there's Johnathan Letendre. Okay? This is like a horror movie scene. Again, not sugarcoating anything. She screams. Brian jumps up. He was sleeping naked. He doesn't have a shred of clothes on. And a battle ensues between Johnathan Letendre and Brian Camp. They are fighting. They are wrestling. Jonathan's glasses fall off. He somehow gets cut in the head. He's bleeding. Brian Camp has him in a chokehold, trying to subdue him. Brooke grabs her phone and she runs downstairs and calls 911. And this 911 call becomes a critical piece of evidence in this case because for the next 19 minutes and 2 seconds, we hear almost a play-by-play account of what is happening inside that house from Brooke Janik's perspective. And you'll hear that 911 call this morning. In fact, the dispatcher who was talking with Brooke, trying to get information out of Brooke, will be the first witness. The 911 call is very difficult to hear and understand because Brooke is so upset, so emotional, she's screaming, she's crying. The dispatcher's doing her best to get the information she needs to deploy the appropriate resources. Medical, state police. What you can hear on that 911 call is shedding valuable light into what happened during those minutes and why we are here today. The call starts off with Brooke hysterical. She's saying the address, 239 South Street, Chesterfield. She's describing what's happening, how Johnathan and Brian are inside the house, they're fighting. At one point, Brian has Johnathan down on the ground. And 7 minutes and 43 seconds into that call, as Brooke is describing, things have calmed down somewhat. Brooke's able to catch her breath. She's explained to the dispatcher who Johnathan is, how she knows Johnathan, how unfortunately she got involved with Johnathan. You hear the first shot in the background. Brooke hears it, dispatcher hears it, Brooke goes hysterical. Oh my God, I heard a gunshot. Now that gunshot is Brian Camp shooting Johnathan Letendre once in the midsection. Brian Camp lawfully owned a firearm. He will say later that he grabbed it off of some countertop or up above some cabinets. And he used it against Johnathan Letendre to defend himself. And we're not here today to debate the legality of that first shot. Okay, that first shot's good. That first shot is self-defense. We're not here about the first shot. That first shot goes into Johnathan Letendre's side. It breaks the 11th rib on his left side. It goes in and pierces his stomach. It pierces his colon. It pierces his liver. This is a hollow-tipped bullet. It's tearing through his torso. Johnathan Letendre falls to the ground, grievously wounded. The medical examiner will tell you that he would have been in immense, immobilizing pain. He begins to bleed internally. By the time his autopsy is conducted, the medical examiner discovers and measures 750 milliliters of blood just inside his torso from the damage from that first shot. Johnathan is down. The threat has been neutralized. That shot was good. We're here today because of what happened in the next 8 minutes and 37 seconds. Once Johnathan Letendre is on the kitchen floor, grievously wounded and bleeding and moaning, Brian Camp catches his breath. He goes and gets some clothes on, first of all. He brings some things outside to Brooke Janik, where Brooke is. He goes back inside the house. The kids, meanwhile, are still upstairs in the bedroom. The kids don't get taken out. They're in the bedroom. And rather than go for the kids, Brian Camp goes for his phone. He finds his phone. He uses that phone to call his boss. They talk for a couple of minutes. The boss then texts him a couple of things. And then with the kids still upstairs and Brooke still outside and Johnathan Letendre still bleeding on the kitchen floor, Brian Camp walks over toward Johnathan with his cell phone, and he takes the last known picture of Johnathan Letendre alive on this earth. He photographs Johnathan Letendre literally dying in front of him. You'll see that picture. Johnathan is face down on the ground. He's holding the back of his head with his left hand. And about a minute and a half later, Brian Camp uses that same weapon with the same hollow tip bullets. He walks over to where Johnathan is lying. He shoots him in the head, killing him instantly. 8 minutes and 37 seconds after he had lawfully shot him in the torso and put him down on the ground, Brian Camp executes him. And that's why we're here. That second shot, which at the end of the case I will argue to you was unnecessary, way over the top, more force than was reasonably needed to defend himself at that moment. Brian Camp walks out of the house when the police get there. He's cooperative. You'll see some body cam footage of Brooke and Brian both walking toward the first trooper who gets there, hands up. He instructs them to get down on their knees. He does. He informs the trooper, the firearm's in my pocket. The trooper takes it from his pocket, secures it. Brian Camp is in rough shape. He's just been in a battle. Didn't go to bed expecting a battle from an intruder. He's covered almost head to toe in blood, Jonathan's blood. He's banged up. He'll later be treated for a fracture in his hand. And then he goes and speaks with the state police at the barracks in Northampton to get his side of the story. And he'll essentially, you'll hear in this interview, tell you pretty much what I just laid out up to a certain point. He's in bed, sleeping, intruder jumps up. Brian Camp doesn't know who the heck this guy is. Doesn't recognize him, doesn't know his name, doesn't know all the negative stuff, doesn't know that there's any handcuffs in the pocket. Those handcuffs never came out. They never played a role in this altercation. Doesn't know that there was a knife in Jonathan's jacket, because that knife never came out, was never part of this altercation. In fact, Jonathan's jacket ends up on a couch in the living room. He says, we were battling, we were hitting each other with things. There were a couple of different firearms in the house. At one point there was this muzzle loader, which you'll hear some more testimony about. They're struggling over what's called a muzzle loader. It's essentially, from what I understand, kind of like a modern day musket. And at one point, Brian actually snaps it open, dumps out the primer so that it can't be fired, slides it out of the house, and Brooke puts stuff near the side of the house. Then there's this old shotgun lying around that they're struggling over. It breaks apart, essentially. And that's when Brian grabs this Sig Sauer pistol, and he admits, yeah, I shot him somewhere around here. Troopers say, well, was it one shot or two shots? Brian says, well, I think it was one. It could have been two. I'm not really sure, but I shot him somewhere in here. And they ask him very clearly, like, where was the second shot? Was there a second shot? I don't really know. Can't really. He doesn't own the second shot. He doesn't say, I talked to my boss, I took pictures, shot him in the head. His memory about that, vague at best. One thing he does say, though, and I think this is telling, he says almost casually, talking about Jonathan breaking in, well, if I ever did something like that, I'd want someone to put me down, too. Put me down. When the police get there, as I said, they secure the scene, they secure Mr. Camp. The state police go into the house. The state police go up the stairs. They first assess the scene. Jonathan's clearly dead. They sweep the house, make sure there's nothing else going on. They go upstairs. The state police remove the children from the bed. They bring the children out to Brooke. They reunite Brooke with her children. Medics start arriving, ambulance arrives, state police arrive, crime scene services begins doing their thing, photographing, processing, gathering evidence. And that's why we're here. At the end of this case, when the judge is giving you full instructions on manslaughter and on self-defense and what it means to defend yourself or defend your family, pay close attention to when he says certain things, including the law does not permit retaliation or revenge. One can use an amount of force that's reasonably necessary to prevent an attack or prevent the reoccurrence of an attack. And the proper use of self-defense arises from the necessity of the moment, and it ends when the necessity ends. And it's our contention in this case that when Johnathan Letendre was on the floor, bleeding from massive damage to his torso, lying face down, shielding himself, as you'll see in the photo that Brian Camp took. He no longer posed a threat. His conduct prior to that point, indefensible, criminal. And if he lived, he'd be on trial. But Mr. Camp took matters into his own hands. He bypassed this whole process that we're doing today. And when you've heard all the evidence and you've heard the law, I will ask you to find Brian Camp guilty of manslaughter. Thank you.
Thank you. Barry Kokonowski.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. Good morning. Good morning. Mr. Gagne was using hands a few times in his opening, and though nothing that we say is evidence, it is telling. Starting with Mr. Camp taking things into his own hands. Mr. Camp was essentially, as outlined by Attorney Gagne, and as I'm going to add actual facts that actually happened, was by himself in this situation for 19 minutes and something seconds in Chesterfield by himself. The 911 call, we expect the evidence to show, was placed around 12:37 and some change. I believe that's what the evidence is being shown. Nobody shows up for 20 minutes. And Mr. Letendre is in that house. And Mr. Camp, the evidence is going to show, was in this situation with two girls, 2 years old, 4 years old, in one bedroom upstairs, and Brooke, who essentially winds up outside on the 911 call. And this guy in his house for that long. And I ask you, just for the record, Attorney Gagne placed his hand over his head like this, assuming that Mr. Letendre was shielding his head. You're going to see that Mr. Letendre had some injuries to his head prior to any shot. But this is the position of his hand and his body lying on his stomach at that point. That is not the position that he was found in when police finally arrived. And that's very important with regard to what was going on in the kitchen after that certain period of time. You're going to hear from the medical examiner who's going to talk about 750 milliliters of 750 milliliters of blood on the left-hand side. And I believe, far from being a doctor, we're going to hear the term hemorrhagic shock, and that Mr. Letendre, at that point, 750 milliliters, was at, I think, between level 1 and level 2, hemorrhagic shock. And the doctor says, that means he was in a lot of pain, sure, but he wasn't dead, and he was able to move, and he was able certainly to talk. You're going to hear about the injury to the liver. You'll hear that Commonwealth doctor opined that the damage to the liver did not strike any major arteries or veins. And you're going to hear from that doctor, I assume directly, and if not, concerning testimony that he has given prior about Mr. Letendre's ability to move and talk, say things and do things, which is why it's important, ladies and gentlemen, when you see the difference between where Mr. Letendre's hand is on his head from the photograph that Brian Camp took. I also want you to pay attention, please. Remembering how Mr. Gagne says this photograph was taken. And by the way, there was a photograph taken of Mr. Letendre at one point. At the same time, there were photographs taken of his room by Mr. Camp, of the girl's door by Mr. Camp. Because of course, the evidence is going to show the police are about to arrive, right? On December 26th, 2022, Mr. Camp and Ms. Brooke were not on again, off again. Mr. Camp and Ms. Janet have 2 kids together. And yet, because apparently their relationship is supposed to be perfect, there was this break. From February 2022 to, not quite sure what the evidence will show, but something in the ballpark of May, June, where they each went their separate ways. But in the evening hours of December 26th, 2022, after making spaghetti and meatballs for Ava, 2 years old, and Alea, 4 years old, and giving them a bath and putting them to bed in a room that shortly before Mr. Letendre decided to break into this house and obviously do something very bad to someone. Shortly before this day, they had switched bedrooms. So, as you go up the stairs, the evidence is going to show, through photographic evidence and I think testimony, of this house, Brian and Brooke were in the left bedroom, and the 2 little girls were in the right bedroom, and straight ahead was the bathroom. A couple of weeks beforehand, it was switched. The little girls were in the room on the left, and Brian and Brooke were staying in the room on the right. But on this night, they put the girls to bed in that room on the right-hand side, did whatever they did, and went to bed in the left-hand room, the day after Christmas. Not exactly sure what time that was, but at some point, Brian, who was sleeping for a period of time, naked, is kind of woken up by Brooke. Brooke hears something, and something to the effect of Brian's like, yeah, the cats are outside, and tries to go back to sleep. They're both in their bed. It is 12:30 something, pitch dark, and Brian is then woken up for real when he hears a scream from Brooke. And when he gets up, sees essentially a form, sees Brooke kind of jump back from the doorway, and sees the form of a guy who winds up being Mr. Letendre in his bedroom at 12:30 probably 5 or so. And there he is naked, girlfriend screaming, 2 little girls across the hall, and Johnathan Letendre, who you'll hear, I think, from the medical examiner, who was 6 feet tall, 190 pounds, jumps on top of Brian Camp on his bed, grabs him by the throat, and starts smashing his head into the wall next to the bed. You're going to see a photograph, ladies and gentlemen, of that wall with about a head-sized hole in the plaster. Brooke is in the room at that point, we expect the evidence to show, standing there. This is happening to Mr. Camp. He's in his bed. He's being choked and his head slammed. We expect the evidence to show that Brian yells, "Do something!" And Brooke picks up something with glass and smashes him over the head, smashes Letendre over the head. We expect the evidence to show that bleeding starts at that point on Mr. Letendre. Does that stop him? The evidence is going to say, is going to show you, no, that doesn't stop Mr. Letendre. The evidence is going to show that he was there for a purpose, and smashing over the head was not going to stop him. And so what that did do, we expect the evidence to show, is it gave Brian a split second in that situation where Letendre sort of loosens the grip and makes it possible for Brian to get out. Brian actually, at this point, is able to position himself behind, as you heard Attorney Gagne talking about a chokehold, is actually able to at this point, and we believe at this point, Brooke is out of the room and heads downstairs and is now talking downstairs. No police show up here yet. Brian is actually able to get behind Letendre, who is big enough that Brian is sort of riding his back off the ground, trying to choke him, and actually gets a hold on him, and the two of them actually fall down. You'll see in the bedroom where this happened, where this started, there's some linoleum over here. There's linoleum on the floor, and the two of them fall in that area, and you'll see blood in that area where Brian is trying to end this. But Letendre, being who he was and what he was doing, was punching backwards and was actually looking for Brian's eyes, and actually stuck a finger into Brian's eyeball so deep that that caused Brian to let go. And Brian runs downstairs. And you'll hear, ladies and gentlemen, he runs downstairs, and I'm not sure if that was a critique from the Commonwealth about the two girls being up in the room. But there's a reason why Brian runs downstairs, and you'll hear why. He runs downstairs naked, with Letendre's blood on him, and runs downstairs, and you heard Attorney Gagne talk about a muzzleloader. At which point he runs downstairs, sees the muzzleloader, and you're going to hear, ladies and gentlemen, that as Brian is backing away from the door. Now, when you come down the stairs, the door to the house is right over there. And for the record, I'm pointing to my left and your right. And I suggest it was open. And Brian grabs this muzzleloader, and it actually looks, you'll see, it actually looks pretty modern for a muzzleloader. It's a black powder type of hunting gun. And you'll hear on the 911 call, you'll hear somebody say, "Get the fuck out!" That wasn't Letendre. And Letendre doesn't. Letendre comes towards Brian. with the gun. And you heard Attorney Gagnon say that there was a wrestling match over the gun. Brian was able to get rid of the primer, which would have disarmed him. But rather than go out the open door, we expect the evidence to show he came forward toward Brian with the gun in his hand and took the gun, essentially removed it out of his hand. They fought over the gun. Brian lost that fight. The gun wasn't stopping. That gun actually gets pushed over to the side, and you'll see, I expect the evidence to show the Commonwealth will introduce some photographs of that gun sort of upside down, leaning on the wall, on the porch outside. You're going to hear Brooks say in the 911 call that, as Attorney Gagnon said, Brian's got him on the ground. Brian's got him on the ground. So Brian again, at that point, sounds like an advantage. However, you're going to hear Brooks again in the 911 call say, I'm going outside. Johnathan got up. Johnathan was able to escape again. And interestingly, you're going to hear, ladies and gentlemen, that Johnathan, whose head was bleeding, we expect, maneuvers his way up onto the couch, where I believe Attorney Gagnon talked about Jonathan's jacket was found. And by the way, Jonathan's jacket wasn't found by police. They missed it. Jonathan's jacket was found by another employee of Dunkin' Donuts who recognized it. And inside that jacket was a knife. And that fight near the couch wound up on the couch. Johnathan on the couch. Brian trying to control him and not being able to do that. We expect you're going to see that there's a big blood stain on the back cushion right next to the plaid jacket that had the knife in it. Brian loses control of that one. Second firearm, you're going to hear a dilapidated firearm Brian tries to use to get him to get out of the house again. Get out. And fire it. Letendre approaches again. Doesn't go away. Comes forward and grabs the barrel of the gun. At which point, the barrel of the gun breaks off of the shotgun. And we expect the evidence to show that at that point, they're swinging at each other. Brian has the stock, Letendre has the barrel. And they wind up into the kitchen where the stock breaks that Brian is using. And at that point, I suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, Brian starts retreating again. Again, he's in his house. He doesn't have to do that. And he shot. Shoots him in the side. And the ME's medical examiner's testimony about that injury is very important. Because it was the only thing that may have been debilitating, we expect the evidence to show, the doctor to say, the only thing that would have been debilitating would have been the pain. But that he was able to move around. And you're going to see, ladies and gentlemen, that the photograph that was taken by my client of the tender, Attorney Gagnon came up and seen everything right here. It was from distance. For a reason. Because at that point he had his hand over his head. And from a distance, he took a picture of it. And then he took a picture of the rope. And then he took a picture of that. And then he took a picture of himself in his bedroom. I'm going to ask, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear as Attorney Gagnon stated, and as you'll hear on the 911, after this first shot, one would think that, okay, this is over. The police are certainly going to be here soon, right? Like, please? That's not what happened. I'm going to ask you, ladies and gentlemen, well, to pay attention to the entire 911 recording. But starting with around 12:40, that's the time that I've got on my notes. Around the 12-minute, 40-second mark, and it changes with whatever the 911 recording is that we hear, the dispatcher starts asking about what's going on with Johnathan right now. Her focus is then on Johnathan. And that's important because, ladies and gentlemen, despite what the Commonwealth has said or is insinuating, Mr. Kemp did not want to be in that kitchen with that guy at that time. But because of what was going on, the focus of the dispatcher, he was, and you're going to hear, ladies and gentlemen, that, and you're going to see, I expect, that certainly Mr. Letendre was able to move, was moving, and you're going to see, ladies and gentlemen, that that barrel of the gun was right next to him on the floor still, and that there was a firearm right above him. I believe it is a revolver, and that Mr. Camp, after all of this, believed that he needed to shoot again because he needed to stop this thing because it clearly was not stopping. And it's important, ladies and gentlemen, as well. You heard, I believe, when the judge read the synopsis of what this case is about. It's not to the back of his head. It's to the top of his head. That's also important. And the trajectory of the second shot is also important with regard to downward, left to right, and forward. And most importantly is looking at the photograph that apparently the Commonwealth is going to be introducing that my client took. That my client took, by the way, at that point, knowing police were coming, hoping police were coming, and weren't there. Eventually they got there. Compare that photograph to the photograph of how Mr. Letendre was found when police finally arrived. Finally arrived. And when you see all of that evidence and hear all of that evidence, ladies and gentlemen, I expect I'm going to be asking you at the end of this trial to find that my client properly used force, a force that needed to be used, after retreating twice, after having control twice and not being able to sustain it, from a guy he did not know, who was bigger than he was, and clearly was there for a particular reason. And with regard to the statement that my client gave to the police, Mr. Gagne sort of course, there's nothing to sugarcoat here, but he did sugarcoat a little bit the conditions under which Mr. Camp gave the statement to Trooper O'Brien and I think another trooper after what had just happened, and that he was banged up. Interestingly, at the end of the 911 call, the dispatcher says to Brooke, did he shoot him again? And when you can't hear Brian, she asks him, did you shoot him again? And he says to the police who aren't there yet, yes,